Hey guys, today I had the pleasure to sit down virtually with Paul Stefansson. Paul's based in Vancouver, I'm in Singapore. We sit back and we look at his tremendous career. He spent the last 18 years with UBS in a variety of capacities, largely on the investment side. We talk about his journey growing up in Canada to moving to Asia, right through to having interviews with people such as Frank Abagnale, who later on was written about and made a movie by Leonardo DiCaprio. Great discussion, great insight. I hope you enjoyed the chat as much as I did. Thanks, Paul. Cheers. Paul, how are you?
Great. How are you?
I'm very good. You know what? I would actually like to swap places and be in Vancouver right now.
Well, there's a lot of good reasons to be in Vancouver. We're 2 hours from Whistler. We can go sailing and skiing in the same day. So from a lifestyle perspective, it's amazing. You can go hiking in the mountains.
Yeah.
So there's lots of great outdoor stuff here to do. But, you know, the dark side of it is it's not Singapore, it's not Toronto, it's not New York. So there's not that much business here. And that's a bit of the challenge. And it's been a bit of a challenge coming back to Canada because I grew up in Winnipeg and I had 38 years there. I had 23 years in Singapore. I've, networks in both places, but I don't know anyone in Vancouver. And so it's kind of like starting from scratch, at age 61. So
that's tough.
Been a
You're
bit challenging.
61. You look fantastic.
Well, you're a very glib man, and I'll take it on face value. I have gray hair.
But the reality is, a lot of people at 61, their energy dies. I'm not even talking about you know what I mean? And I'm 47, and I realize if you start thinking old, that's the end.
Yeah.
You've got to be sprightly. But look, you've got the best of both worlds because you can come back to Singapore every now and again. So I guess you just got to make it work.
Yeah. So look, I think it's, our kids are here, so that's a big draw here. And I think we also, one of the reasons we really came back was my wife didn't want to die in Singapore. And being an expat, is tough because everybody leaves. And so you don't have, very many of those 20, 30-year friends.
Yeah.
And unless you get immersed in the local community, we made a mistake. We put our kids in the American school. It's very tough. And so, we kind of lost a lot of our community in Singapore. We don't have a community in Vancouver. I still have a business network, but not as many close friends anymore. They've gone back to London or New York or wherever. So one thing that I've learned in this journey is the importance of community.
Massively. Well, funny you say that because my wife has always referred to me as Billy No Mates, jokingly, because, I don't have a lot of close friends in Singapore. And the reality is, especially after COVID, but it's very transient. And after a while, you become a little bit gun shy because you think, I'm going to invest 2-3 years with this guy and he's going to move. But I try not to let that deter me,
Yeah. Well, you certainly look at the things that drive happiness and, it's good relationships. It's, and it's experiences and it's purpose. And one thing that, work does for you, well, work has got a lot of problems. It gives you those relationships and it gives you a purpose. So when you do make a career transition and, I'm sort of semi-retired now, you really have to find a purpose. You have to find a reason for getting up every morning, right?
Yeah.
So that becomes really important.
Now, for the few people that may not know you, can you just be kind enough to introduce yourself and your background?
Sure. I'm Paul Stefansson. I always like to say I was born in Canada, but I chose Singapore. So I love Rojak. I love, what's that thing? Lo Hei at Chinese New Year. So I really do love Singapore. I'm genetically 100% Icelandic. So that kind of makes me a Singaporean Viking. So
I love it.
Singapore and
did you do
the Viking side.
Which one did you do? Was it 23andMe or what heritage test did you do?
Well, I know that all my grandparents came from Iceland and all their kids were Icelandic. So I know that genetically I'm 100% Icelandic. When I did the test, I think it was heritage something or other. I think I was about 80% Icelandic or Norwegian and a little bit of Scotch and Irish and English in there, 20% or something.
I love it. I'm 25% Scandinavian, apparently. I thought I was 50% Irish. So I think either the Irish, went to Scandinavia or more than likely the Vikings, traveled overseas.
Well, the Vikings had one big advantage, which was they had keels, which allowed them to sail much better and faster than almost everybody else. But
yeah,
that means I've got to ask you the important question because we'll make you an honorary Viking.
Tell me.
What's the greatest insult you can give to a Viking?
I don't know that.
Of course it is, you're going to die of old age. Because we all should die in battle so that we can go to Valhalla.
100%. Well,
Yes.
Funny enough, I was reading this the other day. There's obviously many dating apps, but in Iceland, the population is so small that the dating app is to double check that you're not sleeping with your first, second, or third cousin. But apparently there's a button on it that you can switch off if you don't want to consider that as important piece of information. I don't know if you heard of that.
No, I can't say I have. It's been probably 40 years since I've been there. I went there 2 or 3 times as a kid, and I worked there one summer. And one of the odd things that happened was I was driving home from a party one night. I hadn't had anything to drink, but they pulled me over because it was 12 midnight and the sun was still out, so I didn't have my lights on. But you're supposed to turn your lights on after 8 p.m.
Yeah.
And so the police actually pulled me over, even though it was broad daylight, right? So
Crazy.
It's a funny place. But in the winter you only get 3 hours of sunlight, which is a little hard on you.
Yeah.
I've never been there in the winter, but the summer is amazing. So I'd encourage everyone to go for a holiday. It's a great trip.
Yeah, beautiful. I found the same. The last time I was in Vancouver is when I was going up to Alaska, and it was very strange, during the summer, only having maybe an hour of darkness at night. But that's an amazing place too. So tell us your journey. How did you come through and decide that you were going to go into finance when you finished uni?
So in university, I studied actuarial math. So I've always had a very strong math background. So I graduated with a commerce degree in actuarial math. And then I went on to write my 10 professional exams to become a fellow of the Society of Actuaries. And I worked at a place called Great West Life on life insurance and investments. And then I went to work in the pension side at North American Life. And from there, a friend of mine started an asset management company. And I was the 35th employee there and managed to buy some equity in that. So I'd encourage anyone on their careers, if they can get into a company and they get the opportunity to get some equity, I'd really encourage them to do that.
Amazing.
We took the company about 3,500 people. We eventually took it public. I was an equity analyst there to start with, using some of my quantitative skills, which I still love. But let's say there were some disagreements and challenges in dealing in the investment room, and so I decided to go into business development, which was a big change for me.
Wow.
So an actuary to an investment guy,
yeah,
and to a sales guy in business development, and so I had to learn a whole range of skills. But both the founders, Marty and Jim, Marty really was great on the investment side, and Jim on the sales and personal, the EQ side. I really learned a tremendous amount there, and we grew like crazy. But we had a value shop, and then we hit the .com bubble, and value didn't go anywhere, and growth was going crazy. So it was very tough times. And at that time, my wife and I loved traveling, and we just had a 1-year-old kid, and it was about minus 40 Celsius in Winnipeg. I don't know if you've experienced minus 40.
It's crazy.
It's very cold. And sometimes with wind chill, we get minus 80. Anyway, so we decided that we wanted to go to Asia. So I sent out, probably 500 emails. I probably had 60 interviews. We eventually flew out there on our own nickel, and I eventually got 3 job offers. But we chose Singapore because, being dummies, we heard that Singapore was Asia for dummies. It's English, it's safe, everything works. And so we've really come to love Singapore. I initially got a job with AXA as a vice president on financial planning. And there was another career change. So I moved now from investment and sales more to financial planning. And I eventually was the CEO of IPAC Financial Planning in Singapore. So I got the license for that, built that up. But I guess they thought I wasn't growing fast enough. And I thought I was going to get fired. They flew me out to Hong Kong. And I got moved sideways into being the head of corporate business development for financial planning. And back then we were trying to sell financial planning to companies like Exxon, all the big companies in Singapore, Exxon, Keppel, many of the oil and gas companies. And so I did that for a while. And then UBS called me and wanted me to work in their core affluent business. So then I moved over to the core affluent business, and I did a tremendous amount of events with people like the Doctors Association, Dentist Association, with accountants, lawyers, tons of different people. And so to try to build that business. UBS eventually decided to get out of the core affluent business, and so I moved more onto the product side, so in product development and sales, and eventually, and I won't bore you with all the details, I moved from being part of the sales team to eventually global head of investment funds. Had various roles across the years, whether it was in investment funds or private equity or hedge funds, but always in those areas, sometimes mandates as well. So really what I had was sort of a team of technical sales support people that would work with the client advisors, go into client meetings, and sort of help them get the right products, and obviously also drive sales as well in those different products when they're appropriate.
I'm so fascinated because you are an avid reader, and I remember the last time I saw you in Singapore, you were kind enough to send me a couple of books, which I'm so grateful for. And those kind of gifts, you remember them. It's not like giving someone a bottle of wine, which is great, by the way. But when you went into sales, did you read any book on sales? Because I find a lot of people in our business, even though we're all in different guises of sales, very few people actually study sales and the art of negotiation, the art of human communication. Did you read much on that?
I read probably about 10 different books on that. And one that really stuck with me was there's a book called You Can't Teach a Kid to Ride a Bicycle in a Seminar. And
I heard of it.
It was by the Sandler, founder of Sandler's. And I eventually hired Raymond, who became a friend of mine. He still runs the Sandler franchise, I think, in Singapore and Hong Kong.
Oh, wow.
And so I took a course, and I got UBS to take the course, because financial services is very funny, is that there are large sales and service elements in the business, but very few people have ever taken a sales course or a communication course or presentation skills course. And that's kind of, since my last couple of years in UBS, I was doing a bit of sales training and sales coaching. And I took the ICF coaching certificate as well.
How did you find that?
And pardon me?
How did you find that? Did you enjoy the experience?
Yeah. So the big part of it is you have to do 120 hours of coaching before you can be certified. And so the hardest part for me was moving away from sales, where you're asking very focused questions that are trying to lead people into a funnel, right?
Yeah.
And to try to be much more open-ended, and also to give people time to think. I think and talk very fast. People move at different speeds. But my experience both as a manager, because a friend of mine was a coach before me and sort of helped me use coaching as part of a management tool, it's much better because when someone comes up with the idea themselves, the implementation is much better.
Yeah.
And so very important tool. I think I would encourage anyone that's a manager to take some basic courses, maybe even the ICF program, because it really helps you manage people, because essentially all you're really doing is asking people questions to help them clarify their thinking, giving them some summaries, maybe occasionally asking them a question, and, giving them a little bit of perhaps an insight. And the most exciting part of it is when I can find someone else's blind spots. I can see your blind spots, you can see my blind spots, but I can't see my blind spots.
Yeah.
And so it's very powerful when you get someone to have that aha moment, right?
I love that. I think what I found in coaching people is I try to teach people rational deductive logic, to take a backward step, because the answers are in front of them. But with my actual sales team, one of the things that I struggle with is most guys that have worked for me, in the past, will read something because I asked them to, which is fine. That's great. But I said, where the real journey begins is when you decide to activate that thought process, when you go online or go to the bookshop and you start doing your research to find out what book works for you. So I don't know if you know this, I used to do a lot of martial arts and boxing, and someone asked me the other day, they said, well, when does the fight begin? Is it in the changing room? And I said, no, it's as soon as you get the phone call to say that the fight's on. At that moment, you're getting ready. And as an athlete, as a business professional as well, your sleep, your nutrition, the technicalities, the mindset, the psychology, it's all inextricably linked. And I quite frankly, I see work sometimes as war. As you know, in private banking, you go to war every day, but with a smile on your face. So it is interesting. I'm just curious, when you look at pivotal moments in your career, having such a different, storied career, What are those few pivotal moments that stand out to you?
Well, I think the first one was when I made the decision to move from being an actuary to an investment or an equity analyst. That was a big change, changing industries. The growth opportunities in investing are just much bigger at that time than they were in insurance. The other thing is, I think it's hard to be an entrepreneur like you and start something yourself. That's very tough.
Yeah.
But being the number 2 guy, being the 10th guy, being the 20th guy in a growing business can be very powerful. So I'd really encourage people not just to look at big companies, but also look at smaller or medium-sized companies.
100%.
Because if you can get that equity stake, you're really, really going to do very well. Obviously, the next big turning point for us was coming to Asia. And the opportunity set, in Singapore 20 years ago was just incredible. And when you layer on that, the advantageous tax system in Singapore, it's just night and day. And it wasn't just, we weren't looking just for the financial aspect, but the adventure, to be able to travel to Myanmar, to get to Bagan, to, go to the Taj Mahal. All these different things, are just incredible. So the life experience, but those would be the bigger turning points, I think, getting to be an equity analyst and getting equity in a company, coming to Singapore, and then really trying to make sure you understand all the different cultures and just so much opportunity to learn.
When I look back at you in terms of when I first got to know you, as I thought of you as a product specialist, you were highly cerebral and very passionate about the areas that you specialized in. Which of the asset classes did you fall in love with the most?
Well, it's probably equities, equities, public equities, private equities. I like things that have the ability to 5, 10x, right? So, bonds can be, they'll keep you safe. They're a little bit boring. You're not going to get 10x on a bond. You're capped on your upside, right?
Yeah.
Some of the better hedge funds are interesting. I sometimes wonder how the heck they manage to get some of the returns they do. Obviously, some of the private, equity managers are just amazing as well.
Yeah.
But it's more the higher octane equity stuff that got me excited. I'm a big, I bought my first share of Berkshire Hathaway in 1999, and I actually went down to Omaha to see him. And so
did you?
I've been a Warren Buffett fan for probably 26 years. So, and that stock has gone up. Last time I looked at my portfolio, I only bought one share, but it went up 815%.
Oh,
so,
wow. That's crazy.
So,
yeah.
So, it's important to, and that's another thing I would pass along to this generation is, I think, because of the way, unfortunately, this generation was raised, where you had a lot of helicopter parents and a lot of participation awards, I think they tend to be a little bit risk averse.
Yeah.
And so I really encourage them to, take career risk, go to that smaller company where you might have a bigger job. There's an old, in sports, there's the whole thing. You can either be, the worst player on the best team or the best player on the worst team. Sometimes, you're going to learn a lot more, being that worst player or the best player on the worst team. And so I'd really encourage people to take career risk. I think also, taking some risk in terms of investing as well, making sure that, they've got a lot of equities or property in their portfolios. And two other things, I think, is taking risks on their network. I'm not sure a lot of people in big companies have much of a network outside of their company. A lot of people I used to know at UBS, they had a huge network in UBS, but not so big outside.
They're very inward looking.
Very important that, pardon me, Paul?
They're very inward looking and insular, people from large organizations, quite typically.
Yeah. So just in case something goes wrong with that large organization, I saw that with Great-West Life, which stumbled for a while here in Winnipeg. And, there were a lot of 50-year-old managers and stuff that were laid off, and they didn't have a network outside Great-West Life. So it was really hard for them to find that next job, right? And the last piece I think that young people need to do is build new skills. And building skills, particularly in the age of AI, becomes very important. Not only knowing how, ChatGPT works, but also building some of the softer skills, as you were mentioning before, whether it's sales, presentation skills. I'm building and have been teaching a course on storytelling. And storytelling is almost the only way that you can get people's attention and get them to care about something, because you're activating two chemicals, dopamine and oxytocin. And I can show you that with one very quick story.
Please.
So This is a story about the CEO of Home Depot. And he was a little upset. I don't know if you know what Home Depot is, but it's basically a DIY store where you buy lumber and nails and all that kind of stuff, right? And so he was a little upset about the service at Home Depot. And so what he wanted to do was ask a bunch of his employees stories about the great service they delivered. And he looked around and he didn't find many. And then he hit upon this cashier. And the cashier told him the story of an older gentleman, probably not dissimilar for me, who was, going and buying some lumber, some nails, a nice little plate to put on what he was building. And he came up to the cash register to check out, and she said, "Sir, did you get everything you need?" He said, "Yeah, no problem." How was the service? And he said, "Great. Service was excellent." Then she thought for a minute and said, "Sir, if you don't mind me asking, what are you building?" And he kind of looked down and said, "My grandson passed away and I'm building a coffin for him." And so she said, "Sir, don't worry. You don't have to pay for this. This one's on us."
Wow.
And so storytelling allows you to communicate messages that are important. And what this led to was the CEO of Home Depot empowered all his staff to be able to make these kind of decisions right there within a $500 limit. So very important that you try to deliver your messages. And if you think about it, we live in a sea of stories. When you wake up in the morning, what were you doing? You were dreaming. That's a story. You get in your car, you turn on music. That's a story. You get to the office, the water cooler, people are gossiping. That's a story, right? You get home, you turn on Netflix, you've got a story. Stories are everywhere except for one place. Paul, can you guess the one place that stories aren't?
Ourselves.
No, we tell ourselves story, corporate presentations.
Okay.
So that's the one area where people really freeze up and they don't really tell stories. So I think it's important, and I'd be laboring the point around stories and very important that you build a skill every year, whether it's storytelling, whether it's sales, whether it's IT, whether it's learning AI. Every year you need to add your stories. So take risk, build that network, and take stories. You would understand the value of networks better than anyone else.
I love that story, by the way, and I firmly believe, I think the best salespeople, I call it the art of selling without selling, because you can talk about other stories. Why I mentioned ourselves is because a lot of people don't know how to tell their own story first. And if you are not confident and you don't love yourself and you can't talk a little bit about yourself and inject yourself into the conversation, no one's going to share with you. No one's going to come along for the ride, because ultimately people only want to work with you if A, you can deliver, and B, if they enjoy working with you. Do you know what I mean?
Yes. Most people are looking. Go ahead, sorry.
No, so I'm curious because, in the 18 years that you were with UBS, you saw that company just grow and just, there were many different iterations of it. But what were some of the challenges that you had wearing multiple leadership roles, being in a company for almost 2 decades?
So I guess initially when I first joined, we were hiring like 50 people a month. So just bringing the people on and and getting the culture, and that was very challenging in the beginning. It was just hiring so many people. And over the years, I've hired a tremendous number of people as well, right? And so, finding good people, keeping good people, very challenging, right? And it's not just about money; it's also about teaching them. And I really tried to focus on building their sales skills, their presentation skills, coaching skills. So I really tried to impart the skills that I had to my staff, tried to encourage them, to improve their business Mandarin, trying to get them to take the CFA as well.
Yeah.
So, I think certainly hiring or finding good people. And to me, the most important way to do that is again, a network. The best people always come from your network. I would let my network know that I was looking for somebody.
Yeah.
And that's where you get the highest quality people.
Yeah.
It also takes a lot of the risk out of it, right?
Yep.
Because if you told me that somebody's good, well, I'm going to trust Paul's opinion.
Yes.
The only danger to it is it can have a little bit of implicit bias if your network isn't broad.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and that's where obviously people like yourself can help tremendously, because you have that broad network and make sure that, we're really seeing all the different candidates, no matter their, racial, ethnic origin or whatever. to make sure you're getting the best person for the job. But that would be one of the biggest challenges, I think, is the people, because private banking at its core really is a people business, right?
100%. I do think there's a lot of nepotism, and I've over the years, my opinion on this has changed. I think, when I place very senior people and they take over an existing business, it's very important that they embrace those people. But when you're hiring new people, it shouldn't just be from your old team, because that nepotism will probably lead to an exodus, and then you have an unbalanced business. So I find if you hire based on meritocracy, based on culture, and you're able to fit that all together, you create close to a dream team. I'm curious, in terms of leaders that you've had and leadership qualities that you tried to impart when you guided the guys that work for you, what were some of the key leadership lessons you learned along the way?
Well, this is an easy one. I never got the chance to work for him, but I met several people that did. And of course, my greatest hero and I think one of the greatest leaders in the world is Lee Kuan Yew. And my friend Kishore Mahbubani, he used to be I think the Singapore's representative at the UN. And he broke his leadership down into MPH, but it doesn't stand for miles per hour. It stands for meritocracy. So make sure you surround yourself with the best people, right? And I think that's an important thing in personal life too. You're kind of the average of your 5 best friends. And if your 5 best friends are like me, a little overweight, well, guess what's going to happen to you? Whereas if they're all running marathons, something else is going to happen, right? And, I think so surrounding yourself with really good people is really important. The next thing is be practical. When I first came to Singapore, I was very confused because it seemed like this weird mix of left and right wing policies. And Lee Kuan Yew, much like Deng Xiaoping, didn't care if it was a black cat or a white cat as long as it caught mice. And so being practical is important. The last one is being honest, which I think, a lot of us have to be honest. And the most dangerous position to be in your career is when you're getting paid a lot, but you're not learning anything. It's okay to be learning a lot, but not getting paid as much, but it's very dangerous to get in that comfort zone, and I think people have to always be, on the lookout to see where they can add more value, whether they can change within the organization or wherever, but make sure they keep growing and trying to add value, right?
Well, that is such sage advice. I'm curious because your career had many different iterations, right? From being a portfolio specialist, senior advisor to a show host. Every time that you stepped up to do something else, how did you embrace that transition? Because a lot of people, I think, shy away from it. But I'm a firm believer that if you've accomplished a black belt in one area, you can transition a lot more quickly to another area because you have transferable skills.
I think my wife has diagnosed me as ADHD, so I enjoy learning. I like new things, so I don't think it's been really a hard thing for me to jump from different things. I kind of enjoy it. I get bored very easily, so I do need to have different things going on. So I like the challenge, and I'm willing to take the risk, and so I never found it really as a big challenge. It's probably harder to stay in that job that I've done for 100 years. I just put a shout out to one of my other bosses, Rene Bowman, who he was a great soccer player, and one of the things he did was he was always great at building teams. He really could create that team spirit, and so I think that's quite powerful as well, is bringing some of those sporting things in where you're really trying to build a strong team, right?
Yeah.
So he was one of them. Scott Keller, another manager I had, great
guy.
manager as well, really understood people. So I've been lucky to have, a few good managers along the way that, have really helped me learn and grow as a person.
That's wonderful. And I'm glad that you've acknowledged that. I appreciate that. Thank you. I'm just curious in terms of the difference between clients. What for you do you feel are the key differences between working with the ultra high net worth clients and institutional clients?
Well, there's a huge difference there. And the analogy I would give you is the difference. Let's imagine that two car mechanics for BMW are talking about the car engine. They're going to talk about carburetors. They're going to talk about all the electronics in there. They're going to talk about all of the details, right? It's a professional talking to a professional. Now, when I take my car in to get fixed, I really don't care if it's the carburetor or a flat tire or a chip or a semiconductor that's broken. I just want my car to be fixed. And I think that is the big difference is when you're dealing with institutional clients, it's professional to professional, right? So you really want to get into the details, the technical details. Whereas I think with ultra high net worth clients, particularly people that have really focused their lives on one business, just because you focus on one business, just because you know everything about the cable industry in China, doesn't necessarily make you a great investor, and maybe you're not even interested in it. So then you have to talk a little bit more big picture, on big picture to get them to understand how important asset allocation is to controlling, the investment returns and the risk they're going to take, getting them to, also understand the importance of fees, that they're paying a fair fee for what they're getting. So it's more of a big picture discussion, whereas with a institutional client, it's much more detailed and much more technical. You can have similar, the one thing that does cut across it is people's personality really, impacts their risk profile. And so that is something that does cut across both.
I find interesting.
The amount of risk someone's going to take is very much related to the way they look at the world and their personality.
And I think the same can be said about one's career, right? Your deep down, your personality will really take you along that career journey. But sometimes people don't think of it like that. Because, the first thing you do if you sit down with a private banker, they'll try to assess your risk profile and your acceptance for tolerance. But what I've realized over a period of time, one's relationship with money can change. Because when you're younger, you're fighting for it because you don't have anything. Or, if you look at the second generation, they're probably trying to preserve wealth. So that's interesting. When we look to the future, because you've always shown a key interest in crypto and blockchain, what are the areas that excite you most about this new business that we're in?
So look, I think crypto, I've made some investments in there, some of them successful, some not so successful. I think crypto, has got a lot of potential, and certainly Bitcoin, I think is close to proving itself as digital gold. Where I'm much more interested now is AI. And AI, I think, is going to change wealth management so dramatically, and basically all of the knowledge businesses, right? And one area where I think it's really going to make the lives of private bankers and everyone much better is I do think it's going to, reduce the amount of administration and compliance that a private banker has to do. And half the time probably is spent on administration and compliance.
Yeah.
So I'm very hopeful that AI, when it's finally fully implemented, is going to reduce that tremendously. And what that means is going to be more time for, the client advisor to work with the clients on their investment strategy, to get to know them deeper, to get to know their family, and that's really the power of private banking, and particularly at UBS. I worked with some clients for 15 plus years.
Amazing.
They've worked with UBS for 20, 30 years. And so it takes a business and it moves it from a transactional business to much more of a relationship business, where we really are trying to make sure that the family and the wealth lasts multiple generations, because it's not guaranteed, right? In Canada, we have an old expression. It's, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. I think the Chinese have an expression for that as well. It's something, wealth doesn't last 3 generations.
Yeah.
And there's lots of research on that, right?
Yeah.
Because, and I see it with my kids is, I never went on an airplane, my kids want to fly business class. Well, that's a very different way of looking at the world.
Yeah.
And I'm, I'm not poor, but I'm certainly not rich either.
Yeah.
And so I really think that, that becomes important. And that's where I think UBS and many of the private banks are quite smart to invest in educating the next generation. And I think, again, that's where AI is going to help. I think, in the future, we'll all have probably AIs that will help with our investments, with all sorts of things. And so I'm very hopeful that we're going to get quite a bit of productivity out of that. What it does mean is that our jobs are going to change tremendously.
Oh, big time. What's interesting that you just touched upon is the one great equalizer in everything is ambition and hunger. Because, so for example, in the old days, they would say sports is a great equalizer, but I've always felt, well, if you've come from a wealthy family, you can afford the best food, nutrition, equipment. But if you come from, very, very humble background, that hunger to be successful and the reason why, i.e. to put food on the table for your family, that changes. And I think that's the one thing that the second and third generation of these families may not have. And that's one thing AI can't fix anytime soon. Maybe in the future, you never know.
Oh, certainly I see that in the people I've hired. I've always said I can teach you everything except the will to win.
Yeah.
You know, in Canada, we call it the kill instinct. Like if I can't teach you to want to win.
Yeah.
And so that becomes very important. And I used to take 5 to 10 interns every year. And it was just amazing the difference in motivation. I had one intern that was doing head bobs. I took them to a client meeting and he was almost falling asleep. And so, you know, the motivations in some people that, you know, came from very successful families, and they worked harder than I did.
Yeah.
And you know, really motivated. So, you know, I think with all things, Charlie Munger always used to say, and I think the research backs this up, is you want to try to change the peers for your kids, right? If your kids have motivated peers, I think they'll do it. And it comes back to what we talked about in Lee Kuan Yew and meritocracy.
Yeah.
You want to surround yourself with people that are motivated, and it's going to make you motivated, right? And so that peer group becomes very important for us and for our kids, for our employees, you know, and
iron sharpens iron.
One of the books
iron sharpens iron.
Yes. Well, there's a book about Netflix. I don't know if you read the book on Netflix. I think it's like something, no rules or something like that.
Yeah.
Anyway, but one of the things that happened to them, they had to fire half the staff at one point because the business went really down, and they thought it was going to be a disaster for morale. So what do you think happened? Morale actually shot up.
Yeah.
Because they got rid of a lot of the people that were complaining and were B players, negativity. And so, you know, Netflix came up with this model, which is every year you take all the people, you know, that you absolutely have to keep, and you would fight, you know, tooth and nail to keep, and you keep those guys and you retrench everybody else.
Yeah.
And so sometimes, you know, it's really, really important to keep, you know, the quality of your peers up.
I think Netflix has so many different interesting business models, you know. So my head of Hong Kong, Mark, I told him a few years ago, I said, look, I'm taking you off leave. I'm putting you onto the Netflix model. And he goes, what do you mean? I said, well, you won't officially have any leave. And he said, I need to have holidays. And I said, no, you're missing the point. You can take as much leave as you want. I'm not going to monitor. I'm not going to measure it. Just give me a heads up. So if you need a little bit of coverage, and basically you're running your own time. And the reality is, I measured it for the next 3 years. He ended up taking less time off, funny enough, because you know, I always think, what I tell my staff is, at the beginning of the year, you should be looking forward to 2 holidays, whether or not they're ideally going abroad. But if you have something to look forward to, like in the summer holiday and the winter holiday, the excitement and knowing that you're working towards that changes the whole dynamic of the year. Do you know what I mean? Something to look forward to above and beyond work. I'm curious, because talking about sales, what are some of the most common mistakes that you've seen individuals make at work, and how do you think they could fix those mistakes?
So I think probably the one that I'm probably the most guilty of, and my wife would say this, is I think that, and it's, you know, one of the basic things in Sandler, they call it the dummy rule, which is often when people start in sales, they do well, then they learn a bunch of stuff and their sales fall off. I think because investment people and, you know, client advisors tend to know a lot about their products, they tend to talk too much and don't listen enough and don't ask enough questions. Yeah. And so that's where I think people make, you know, one of the first mistakes is really, you know, not listening, not asking the right questions, and thinking that, you know, sales is about talking about my product. So that would be the first mistake. Probably the second one is not being proactive enough. Often because certainly my sales teams were technical sales support, so they came from more technical backgrounds than sales backgrounds. So they were great if a client advisor came to them and said, I got this client. But they were very bad at being outbound to talk to client advisors and walking around and trying to get to know them and so on, right? And so, that's where the SAM or the desk meeting becomes powerful, where you're trying to present to the team and build some credibility.
That to me, by the way, I think what I tell investment advisors specifically is engagement, walking the floor. Because if you've written the world's greatest love song and it's not played on the radio or on iTunes, no one's going to even know it exists. And you can't understand the pain points unless you go out and speak to people and find out what it is. So I think that engagement that you said, and the reality is you're not even really just selling, you just have increased your visibility.
Yeah. So that becomes important too. And, also having some passion about a product and say, look, Paul, I really like this, this fund, it's got great performance. It's a really smart manager, and, it's got low correlation. So, really, can we talk to your client about this? So, you also have to believe that, you've got something worth talking about. So I think that passion becomes important.
Yeah.
I also think that, helping clients, and then this can be a bit dangerous, but, using things like negative reverses where you're trying to get people to really think, right? And so, so what you're saying is, even if this, fund could offer you a 20% return, you wouldn't even put 2% into your portfolio. Is that what I'm hearing? So trying to push people away from you is really important. Now, the disadvantage of that is that sometimes people are going to say yes and it's over.
Yeah.
But to me, sales is really about getting a yes or a no.
Yes.
And what kills you is a maybe. And so things like an upfront contract, and these all come from Sandler, is very important. Today we're going to talk about, these investments. Happy for you to say yes, but I really like to give you permission to say no. And just so that we make a decision, I'd rather you said no than maybe. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So I think those are some of the basics I think most people
but that
need to work on.
Especially, Paul, in Singapore, I always joke about this, but I think it took me 7 or 8 years to learn that yes was actually no. But culturally, people in Singapore in particular are almost afraid to offend you. So I've spent the rest of my career in Singapore bringing the no's forward. And as you said, ruling things in, ruling them out quite quickly. And what you said about the negative, I call that the art of the pull away. But there is an art, there is a skill, but at the fundamental root, what you've just said is brilliant. And it's something that I think it doesn't even come into most people's consciousness as a technique. Brilliant. I love that. If you are sitting down with a high performing individual, at work or now in your current role and you're coaching them, and these guys are already at their top of their game, how do you approach those meetings?
Well, generally speaking, I haven't got too many coaching engagements with people that are at the top of their games. Usually I'm brought in when there's a problem. So usually I was brought in to work with clients that were quite challenging and client advisors or, people that had challenges hitting their numbers. So, I think in sales management, you want to try to reinforce your strong performers. So the only thing I would say about the strong performers is if you can take some work off their desk so they can do more of the sales, more of the hunting, I think you're going to do better. But I think a lot of these people really know what they're doing. And I don't really think they need that much, in the way of coaching. Where I've had people that, perhaps have the relationships, but don't really know how to close or don't know how to run a pipeline. So there's a variety of things, but, just taking them through the basics of sales is, pretty, it's really a numbers game. Where are your numbers? Where's your pipeline? So you can predict what's going to happen and your boss is going to feel a lot better. And, your wife's or spouse is going to feel a lot better. And then it gets into more of the how, right? Do you know how to do sales? Do you know how to position the product? Do you know how to close? So it's really breaking it down into pieces and just sort of seeing where it falls apart. But surprisingly enough, a lot of people don't even really have a process, right?
It's crazy. When I one of the books that I read, I've read it a couple of times, is Ray Dalio's Principles, and he talks about identifying patterns. And I think in everything that you do, if you look back and you identify patterns and you break it down, you realize, this is where in the process something went wrong. But most people, as you said, they don't have a process. They don't have a beginning, a middle, and end. And the other thing on that note I find very interesting, when people have wins, they often don't analyze how they won. So to ensure that it's not a fluke, you should analyze can I do this again? Can I replicate it? Can I do it 2 other ways? So I've got 3 different avenues to accomplish this success, because most people only look at things when they go wrong, right? So I think you've got to turn that upside down sometimes as well. Now, one of the things I wanted to ask you about, which is really interesting. So when you were at UBS, you had a themed investment show, and then you interviewed various people. The one guy that I really wanted to ask you about was Frank Abagnale, and how that came about. And, you know, most of us have seen the movie with Leo, but tell me a little bit about that, because I'm curious.
So one of the guys that worked with me, he just cold emailed him. And so he said, hey, would you come on to our UBS podcast? I guess he had worked for UBS before in the US. And so he was great. So I interviewed him twice. And but he really has really worked at it, and he's got soundbite messages, you know, to everything.
Yeah.
Like we talked about identity theft, and he said, look, all I need to do is get your name, your exact date of birth, and your social insurance number, and I can hack your identity. I can open up bank accounts. And so he really spoke in sound bites. And when you actually go look at his YouTube, but what it shows you is having very well rehearsed messages and stories is a very powerful way of communicating, right? You know, he did have a very sad story that, you know, he had his dad and his mom, I think, had some trouble, and he ended up running away when he was 15. And I think he was on the road or in jail for like 10 or 15 years. And his dad died before he came back, and they had quite a troubled relationship. And he was quite upset about the fact he never really got to talk to his dad again.
Yeah.
And so he really tried to make sure that, you know, he looked after his kids and there was a strong relationship there. And, but no, the way he communicates was just so crystal clear, right? He knew.
That's probably what led to all of his criminal success, because he probably spoke with such conviction, and he probably refined it as he went further on in his career.
Yeah. The scary thing that he said, though, is that crime is much easier now than it was in the past.
Well, I would imagine online, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Much easier.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So I think we all have to be really careful there. And I remember things about him. And so he told stories. He's very clear, you know, and so I remember a lot of the stuff he said. And I think we can all learn from that. Really fine-tuning our communication skills, very important.
Yes, it's so interesting, because I think when you talk to people that have had a very storied past, I remember listening to the CFO of Enron, and who went to prison, and, you know, one of the questions that was asked of him this evening, it was a round table event, was, you know, when did you realize that what you had done was wrong? And it was only maybe like after a year of being in prison, because the year that he was sentenced, he had been nominated as one of the best CFOs in the country for effectively doing the same thing. But I think the reality is the morality of what he was doing was wrong. But I think when you look back at someone's career and what they've been through, and they're introspective, there's so many lessons to be learned. One of the other things I really wanted to ask you about is, you know, for people that listen to my podcast that are up and coming in their careers, what advice would you give them beyond what you've already shared about maybe working for smaller firms?
Well, I think it's the 3 points that I've been hammering all day. Is number one, take some career risk. Go for that smaller firm where you can be the best player on a bad team, or, you know, maybe the best player on a smaller team. Number two, you know, build a new skill every year. So make sure you learn presentation skills, sales, IT, maybe it's Mandarin, whatever, you know, you want to learn, but make sure you're learning AI. And then building your network. I don't think most people understand, and you would understand this, but I'm not sure everyone does, is because networks are based on Metcalfe's law. Are you familiar with Metcalfe's law?
No. Please share.
So it's a computer science term, and basically it says the value of the network is the square of the number of nodes. So if there's 2 people in a network, it's worth 4. If there's 100, it's worth 10,000. So adding to your network is really important. And I don't think people understand how to add to their network. And I think it's really important to understand the concept of reciprocity, right?
Yeah.
And the way this was explained to me in a great book called Influence, by Robert Cialdini, And basically, there was a group called the Hare Krishnas, which were kind of Indian-looking religious people, and that were in the 60s and 70s and 80s in Canada, US. And they would ask for donations all the time, and they get nothing. They changed one thing in their program. They put a flower in people's hands. Donations just went crazy. So when you're networking, you always want to try to think about how you can help the other person, right? You know, in maybe I can't give you business, which would be the best way to help you, but maybe I can help you plan a trip to Vancouver.
Yeah.
Maybe I can introduce you to someone that you might want to hire to run your Vancouver office. But always thinking about how you're going to help the other person is how you build strong networks, right? And I don't think people understand that. It's not about handing out a bunch of cards. That's not what it's about. It's helping people.
I love that. I always say your net worth equals your network, right? Because if you lose everything and you need to start again tomorrow, you can only do it by picking up the phone. I love that.
Yes.
As an avid reader, what would you say are one or two books that you would recommend to aspiring investors?
Well, of course, you're going to have to get Intelligent Investor by Benjamin Graham. I would read, you know, all of Warren Buffett's letters, which you can get in a book, or you can get them online as well, right?
Yeah.
You know, Howard Marks, you know, is great as well. George Soros, you know, I probably have got too many in there, but one of the insights I had is I'm setting my library up right now, and it's a bit of a mess right now. I probably have 600 books on investing. And what had occurred to me was that when you're reading a nonfiction book,
yeah,
if you don't take the time to build a model from it, you might as well read fiction.
Yeah.
Because I don't remember half of those books.
I love that.
And so very important that when you know, and I did one recently, just an example. There's a book called Super Communicators. And so I broke that down into a very simple thing. Well, what do super communicators do? Well, they're very strong on questions, but they not only ask 10 times as many questions, but they ask deep questions. Not what job do you have, but what do you like about your job, right? And the final thing is they do the only prove that they're listening, which the only way to prove that you're listening is to paraphrase what the other person said.
Yes.
The next thing they do is they match. If you're talking about logic, something logical, I match logic. If you're all of a sudden got emotional, I go emotional. The most interesting piece was if you get into an identity issue, then I try to find a common identity with you. That's a very powerful one. Doctors use that with anti-vaxxers, and they would go, well, I believe in vaccines. You don't, but we're both parents. We both coach baseball. And so by building those common identities, they build a bridge. The last piece that was very powerful is if you have to have conflict, you want to limit the scope, you want to think about the time, and you want to control yourself. But if you don't build a model from the books you read, you've just wasted your time.
Well, that's
so that model building.
Amazing advice. Amazing advice.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people, you know, so for example, I'm very happy with people reading ebooks, but if you're reading something that you're studying, typically what I will do, so firstly, I've got an Excel spreadsheet with the books that I'm planning to read, and something left field will come up and I'll add it to it. But otherwise it's too easy to forget, right? And I have a goal. Yeah. I want to accomplish certain things, and I always do things that I say, what's closest to the money? What is going to make an impact on my business today? And then literally at the end of every book, I create a PowerPoint presentation. It's a short one sometimes for me, so I can go back and refer to those notes. But I love that. I absolutely love that. It's a great note for all of us listening. If you weren't in finance, what other career? I told you could be a villain in James Bond or Steve Jobs. But what career would you have had?
Well, my favorite podcast is How to Take Over the World. So I've always fashioned myself as a bit of a global dictator, but I think the spot's been taken by a few other people already. So I'm not sure the opening is there. No, I love history, and so I love ancient Rome. I love history, like World War II. So I probably could have been a historian.
Yeah.
The only problem with that is you get a very, very narrow field, right? I'm a kind of a big picture guy, but for sure it would have been something in academia, maybe history, maybe business school. I don't know, but probably if I hadn't gone into finance, I think I probably would have gone into something in got a PhD and did something and did some research and in that area.
I love it. Now, I'm not talking about regrets, but as parents, I always think a little bit about my children, what their future looks like. So if you were to go back into finance today as a 25 or a 30-year-old, what would you do differently? Would you go in and work your way up in a different trajectory?
Well, I think that certainly today, I think, certainly the traditional thing has always been investment banking. Probably now it's private equity, because that's where the big money is, right?
The doulas.
Again, I think, and if you look at that book, you probably read it before, What Color is Your Parachute?
Yeah.
Most jobs aren't in big companies, and it's very tough to get in there.
Yeah.
But, I still think if you get the opportunity, I think you'll learn a lot in private equity, right?
Yeah.
You'll learn how businesses run, you'll learn how to finance them, all those kind of things are quite important. So if you get that opportunity, I think that's still a great place to be. And I think going into a big company for someone, whether it's asset management, wealth management, insurance, any of these things for a little while is good. But I do think after 5-10 years, you want to start looking for some of the smaller companies where there are more opportunities. I also think, fintech, I think there's probably going to be some interesting opportunities there. I think if you think about, the newspaper business, Google and Facebook wiped them out.
Yeah.
Right. They took the whole advertising business. When you combine AI, if you think about what the internet did, the internet reduced the cost of getting information to zero. AI has the potential to reduce the cost of intelligence to zero. And if you think about that, there's going to be some unique businesses like Uber that took a GPS and put it together with a map and, some taxis. There's going to be some very interesting changes in all of those businesses. So I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities in fintech when you combine the internet with AI and disintermediation. Now, it'll be slower in finance because we have so many regulations, but going to be tremendous opportunities taking AI and applying it to finance. So that's where I think the home runs are going to be.
Love it.
And of course, if you can get an equity position in something like that, because the other thing that's going to happen is my son's a computer programmer.
Okay.
And he's estimated that AI allows him to program 50% more efficiently. They're now talking about people that are going to be one-person billion-dollar companies.
Yeah.
So
staggering.
I think the opportunity for all of us to become computer programmers is around the corner. So combining finance with computers, I think, could be very powerful.
I love that. Great insight. Looking back, who would you say has been the biggest influence on your career?
Charlie Munger, probably.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
What's the one skill that every leader you feel should master? The one skill.
I'll give you two: listening and the golden rule.
Good. I love it. I love all your answers, man. Tell me something about you that very few people may not know, that you can publicly tell us.
Well, even though many people think I'm a pretty tough guy, if I cry a lot. So every time I watch It's a Wonderful Life at Christmas, I cry. So I cry at movies. I read The Kite Runner, the book about Afghanistan.
Oh man, that's
KL Airport.
That's
for 3 hours, and I started crying after that one.
Yeah.
So the one thing they don't know about me is even though my staff used to call me Stellinson, I actually a story can really move me, and I do think I try to be very helpful to people, particularly people in need.
Yeah.
So we built a school in Nepal for people, which was quite an amazing experience, and so
beautiful.
I think that ability to help, I think, is very important.
It is. I find, it's interesting. I've learned my son is 18 now, goes into national service in a couple of weeks, and he was not very athletic, and he went on to become a Singapore amateur boxer and, really changed his physique. But what I realized in his journey, because he told me a few years ago he was afraid, and I had to really wrestle with how to coach him through that. And it's strange. I learned at the age of 44 that I've actually been afraid my entire life and my career, and how I'm an introvert by nature. Most people wouldn't guess that. And I've learned how to become extroverted during those moments that we need to at work. But that was a very cathartic exercise. And so yesterday, I dropped one of my best friends off at the airport, and I messaged him and I said, thanks for making the trip. I was a bit teary-eyed when I left. And he wrote back to me, he said, you're such a soft lad. But as I get older, I'm very happy to embrace that side of things, because that's real, that's human, right? Now, when you are disconnecting from everything, especially now that you're semi-retired in your free time, what do you get up to? What do you enjoy?
Well, you probably can guess this one. I love reading. So, I read probably 1 or 2 books a week.
Wow.
And now I have a bit more time to build models, and I'm trying to write some book reviews. So I do that. My wife likes hiking, so she's been to Everest Base Camp twice. So we do a fair bit of hiking.
Amazing.
Do a little bit of skiing. We have a bit of a social life we're building up slowly here. My son and I, often get out and do some stuff together. He likes walking, so we'll often go for a walk together.
How old's he now?
He's 25.
Okay.
He lives with his girlfriend in Burnaby. So, and our daughter's here. So try to work with her on math. She's not as good at math as the rest of us. So I've been working with her a little bit on her math. And
how old's she?
So, she's 19.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny how each child is very different. I'm just curious, if you could sit down and interview any 3 people from history, past or present, in different areas, they come from a different background. Which 3 people would you like to have a conversation with? So from the investment world.
From the investment world.
As a starting point, and then as a historical figure, just to give you some ideas. I'm just curious.
There was a guy called, I can't remember his name right now. He's a Jewish financier, Bernard Baruch.
Okay.
So he made and lost several fortunes in the U.S., and he was advisor to many U.S. presidents, and incredibly successful guy. So he would be an interesting guy from an investment perspective. From a historical perspective, of course, Julius Caesar, maybe Scipio Africanus, another Roman that beat the Carthaginians. So
what about a novelist? What about a writer? Someone that you could, maybe sit down and unpack how they wrote that book.
That one's easy. Mark Twain.
Okay. Oh, I love it. Yeah. Great answers.
Oh, Mark.
Paul, tell us a little bit about what you're doing now, and I'll put a link so people can contact you, but can you just share a little bit about what you're doing now and how people can reach out to you?
So I guess I do a little bit of investing, angel investing, and run my own personal portfolio. So investing, and I guess I've got about 4 or 5 different angel investments, and I try to look at that. I look at whether I can, whether I'm interested in what they're doing, whether I can personally add some value, and whether it scales. So that's kind of my criteria to look at there. Also, I do a bit of business coaching. So I work with startup entrepreneurs, and I always say, for friends, family, and fools, it's free. For startups, it's free too, unless it gets to be a lot, in which case it's equity. And then for corporates, they have to pay.
I love it.
And then I do a little bit of training for corporations. So I just did in Singapore, for an insurance broker, I did a course on storytelling. I've done a variety of training. I'm working on a training program in financial history and how AI is going to affect banking. And I work with my friend Keith Carter, who does a lot of stuff on AI. So a variety of things, but primarily investing, coaching, and training.
You've always been so giving with your time. You're no nonsense, no bullshit kind of guy, but I've always found you very kind, very generous, and I'm very grateful that you did today's podcast. Paul, thanks so much. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been fun. It's the first time I've been interviewed. I've always interviewed before, so it's a bit of a turnaround for me.
How do you find it? How do you find talking about yourself?
A lot easier than making up the questions.
Well, it's been a pleasure, and thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you. Take care.